Hi everyone. I'm recording an assessment guide for our first assignment for EHLI300 on children's poetry. You might want to have your assessment guide handy so that we can refer to it as I talk you through the assignment. You'll also need your course reader as I will be using one of the poems from there as an example, and we'll go through that together. Just to bear in mind that the assignment is still due on the 21st of April, but please do keep your eye on ECI and your email in case there are any changes. Your assignment is writing a response paper to one of the poems in the assessment guide. A response paper gives the reader of the poem the opportunity to respond to it on various levels. So you must choose one of the poems and then write a critical response to it. You should, in your response, take into account, where relevant, some of the following things, such as theme, attitude and speaker or voice, form and structure, rhythm and rhyme, language features, and poetic devices. Now, not all of those things are going to be relevant for every single poem. So part of the assignment is you choosing what is relevant and important to speak about. So please don't, for example, make these into headings and then feel compelled to have to write something about each one of them. It needs to be a lot more natural and sort of suited or tailored towards your chosen poem. The assignment will be or take the form of an essay of no more than 800 words, so it's not really that detailed, but it should provide a sound overview of the poem and explain the way in which you have read that poem. You do need to ensure that you substantiate your response with examples from the poem, and I'm going to talk about how you might reference the poem or quote from the poem in order to do that. There's also a rubric in the assessment guide, and I think it would be very good if you had a quick look at the rubric to see how it will be marked, which gives you an idea of where to focus on, for example, and what is expected. A guide to writing a critical response to poetry has been uploaded on ECI, so you are welcome to go and have a look at that and read through it. But I was thinking that it's probably a lot better for you to get a sense of how to engage with a poem from the reading of it the first time to actually then producing something in writing before you even attempt doing this yourself for the assignment. So my intention now is to do that and model that process for you using the poem The Sounds in the Evening by Eleanor Fairgen. So please, would you pause the video and find this poem in your course reader. I hope you read the poem a number of times just to really get a feel for it. Before you do anything else, you really need to experience the poem, and I really hope that the module so far has emphasized that before you can engage with the poem, you have to experience the poem and respond to it on a personal level. So if you've not already done this, please pause the video again and go and read the poem a number of times on your own, just with the intention of experiencing the poem. All right, so first of all, I think sometimes it can be helpful to look at the title of the poem and perhaps underline or highlight words that stand out. So for me, sounds and evening were relevant. And I think it's definitely something we've all experienced before, where when it's dark, sounds seem to get louder, or certainly we become more aware of them because our other senses are dulled. And I think this poem really is an invitation to kind of close your eyes and listen to the sounds, because it's just a really beautiful poem and very descriptive of sounds in general. Okay, so before we really get into any further details, what do we really notice first? For me, what stood out anyway was a sort of playfulness, the focus on the sort of very lyrical sound quality of language. The poem is really all about sound. So We find that obviously in terms of the content and so on, but actually in the language itself. So for example, in the line, the click of the clock, we have that alliterative k sound, which is in a way also reminds me a little bit of the tick and tock of a clock. So it's really playful, the way it reminds you of other sounds even. And again, this might then bring you back to the title, and you then notice, oh wow, okay, it's about the sounds in the evening. So we are tuned to look for these sounds in the poem itself. There's also a lot of onomatopoeia, which is another feature that poets use in terms of devices to enhance the sound of a poem, like crick, the crick in the boards and the creak of the chairs. Those words, they're very descriptive. They sound like what they are describing. And then we have something much more delicate a little bit further down in the next line. The fluttering murmurs outside on the stairs. It's very detailed, and it just strikes me as such a rich and evocative description. Fluttering murmurs, it sounds soft, you know, it's delicate. It kind of reminds me of the fluttering of butterfly wings. It really captures the softness and the delicacy of the sound. So some sounds are louder, like crick, creak. They're strong sounds, and then you have this delicate sort of fluttering murmurs on the stairs as well. And then I suppose as you read this poem, what struck me is that the poem is really a sensory experience for your ears. It's through these words, it brings us closer to this shared experience that we've all had of listening to sounds in the dark. And it really captures this moment perfectly. So in that sense, it's really quite an amazing poem. Then the next couple of lines, so outside on the stairs, the ring at the bell, the arrival of guests, the laugh of my father at one of his jests, the clashing of dishes as dinner goes in, the babble of voices that distance makes thin. We get the sense that the speaker of this poem is outside of this experience. In other words, they are excluded from the activity that is making all the sounds. They are simply lying there listening to it or hearing these sounds. So they're not part of the experience. And I suppose at this point we can kind of make some guesses about who is the speaker of the poem. And we might say, well, it's clearly a child because there's a mention made of my mother, my father. And it's very possible then that we would realize, yeah, it's probably a child who's in bed and adult activity is continuing in the house, and they are sort of being excluded, and they are listening to all of these sounds. So yeah, so when it comes to who is the speaker, we might, yeah, at this point be able to say it's a child in bed, and the parents and the adults are awake. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but I think just up to this point in the poem, I think what I really want you to just appreciate is the very descriptive way in which sounds are dealt with. This is also the sort of poem that one really wants to read aloud, so you can hear the rhythm of the lines. The lines tend to be quite short, and the rhyme scheme as well is sort of structured. It sort of almost lulls us to sleep a little bit by the end of the poem. But you'll notice the sort of A, B, C, B rhyme scheme, and that's repeated throughout. So there's nothing unusual about the rhyme scheme. So you can just annotate that on your poem with using letters. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next slide to continue discussing the poem. Okay, so let's continue. The mewing of cats that seem just by my ear, the hooting of owls that can never seem near, the queer little noises that no one explains, till the moon through the slats of my window blind rains, and the world of my eyes and my ears melts like steam, and I find my pillow the world of my dream. And that brings us to the end of the poem. So there's a couple of things I just wanted to discuss here. Obviously, I'm doing this in a fairly sort of easy, less detailed, less labored way. But I'm doing that on purpose to sort of demonstrate that to engage with a poem, you, for example, don't need to comment on every single line, and you don't have to pick out and underline and identify every single poetic device. It's really just about the experience of the poem. And so that in that regard, you're not expected to comment on absolutely everything, and therefore not to have to write about everything in the poem. Just going back to who the speaker is. So we can agree that this is a child who's lying in bed. Now there's the line here, the queer little noises that no one explains. We might say, well, is that maybe indicating that the child is fearful of the dark or scared of the dark? But I don't really think that is the case here. Sounds do become strange, and we've all had that experience where we can't identify what a sound is, and perhaps that is a little bit scary, especially in the dark. But the tone of these lines here is really not threatening. So I don't think it would be correct to say that this poem is about fear of the dark, for example, or a child being scared of being in bed. It really isn't. It's just about noticing these sounds, and obviously when it's dark, the sounds might seem louder, and the child is more aware of them as well. And I get the sense here that the child is listening with interest and not fear as such. The rhythm of the poem really does lull the child to sleep. As I said on the previous slide, the lines are kept short and simple, following that A, B, C, B rhyme scheme, which continues on in, as I said, a very sort of rhythmic way right to the end of the poem. There's something gentle about it. Ultimately, it does lead the child to actually fall asleep. And it's like a really beautiful image at the end of the poem that really describes that. So, and the world of my eyes and my ears melts like steam, So we have a simile here. But really what I want to respond to is not to say this is a simile. It's a beautiful use of language that provides us with an image to describe a process. So it's this kind of dissipating consciousness brought on by sleep. And if we think about steam is something that sort of, just sort of dissipates into the air, disappears slowly and melts away. And like steam, the consciousness of the world around this child, also their awareness of this world sort of melts away as they get sleepier and sleepier. And then finally, it gives up the grip on the child completely, and the child falls asleep. And then that obviously brings us to the final line, as I find my pillow, the world of my dream, and the child is asleep. So all these sounds that the child has been listening to of the evening, of the adults, sort of has lulled the child to finally fall asleep. So my overall impression of the poem really is just, firstly, I think it touches on something that we've all experienced as children. This kind, maybe even as adults actually, sort of just listening to the sounds around you, and in some ways that can be quite comforting as well. And just what struck me as really beautiful in this poem is just the Eleanor Fairgen's ability to capture those sounds and put that, to use language and writing to capture what is really an auditory experience. And for that reason, I really, really like this poem. Now let's talk about moving from reading to writing. We've just read the poem, and now we need to translate our experience of reading the poem and engaging with the poem into a written response. At this point, it might be useful for you to have a look at the guide to writing a critical response to poetry that I mentioned earlier. You can, if you like, pause the video and go and download that so that you have it in front of you. In that guide, you'll see that step 1 is read. So it seems really obvious, but obviously it's something that a lot of people tend to skip for some bizarre reason. They feel like you're not really doing any work if you're just reading or rereading and rereading a poem. But in actual fact, that is what you have to do. That is what is required. You have to read the poem a number of times in layers to be able to really get to the real true engagement with that poem. All right, then step 2 speaks about making notes in the margins, or just engaging with the poem, and in that sense having a pencil in your hand as you read the poem. So if step 1 is just reading it out loud, for example, a few times, step 2 would be sitting down with a pencil in hand and beginning to make notes in the margins. You would have noticed in the slides I'd just shown you that I had made many notes and underlined things and drawn arrows and squiggly lines and circles and whatever on the poem, and that's really what you should be doing as well when you're engaging with your poem. So please, again, that's not something that you can really skip. You have to read the poem with a pencil in hand. Step 3 talks about engaging with and thinking about the technical details that add up to the overall effect the poem has. So you've now hopefully had a sense of that effect. You've read the poem, you've experienced the poem, you've already started thinking about how you personally respond to that poem, and now you're able to really ask yourself the question, how did the writer or the poet achieve this effect? And that's really where you do need some technical understanding of poetry to be able to fully engage. Okay, and then, so I'm not going into all the details. You must really go and read the guide yourselves. Step 4, the final step, is the writing stage, and that really comes last. So don't feel like you need to begin writing immediately. That's really not how this assignment is going to work. Step 4 is when you are now have done all the other steps and you are ready now to begin writing. Just to bear in mind, some basic rules still apply, such as basic essay structure, having an introduction, having coherent paragraphs that are connected by just one main idea, and having a conclusion and so on. The guide will also then tell you how can you quote from the poem, so what are the conventions for doing that. I'm not going to talk about that here. Please read the guide. I've done a model or an example of a poetry response paper. It's very brief, it's short, but I think it does perhaps describe or show what is expected of you in this assignment. So let's begin with some basics. So what I've done here is, you'll see again I've annotated my text. That's really just for you to be able to understand the different parts and how they work in terms of a poetry response paper. The Sounds of Evening by Eleanor Fairgen is a poem that vividly describes the sounds a child hears as he or she lies in bed in the dark. The sounds of the house around them are amplified as the child's senses are dulled by the dark. In this way, the reader is invited to share briefly this auditory world of the child at bedtime. So that's my introduction. It's pretty general. It's not going into any specific details or anything like that, but it does answer the question, what is the poem about? Just some basics. Please always mention the full title of the poem and the poet, and always underline the title of the poem. So your introduction should just have that as a standard thing. The language is playful and focused on the lyrical elements of language. Sounds are played with in a manner that makes this poem to be read aloud. Within the first few lines, the reader encounters alliteration, for example in line 3, where we read click and clock, words that are also phonetically similar to tick and tock. This adds to the sound play by reminding the reader of the noise of a clock. I'm not speaking about a lot of detail there, but I'm just using an example to support the statement I've made, which is that the poem is very playful and in terms of the language, and is focused on the lyrical or sound elements of language. So I need to back that up, and I've just really drawn on one example. So the example from line 3. Okay, and perhaps at this point I should also mention that in general, it's usually a good idea to work through the poem chronologically. So in other words, start at the beginning and then work your way through. Not always, okay, but in most cases that's the logical way to do it, rather than saying I'm going to discuss all the poetic devices or all the metaphors or something like that, which kind of decontextualizes a lot of the things you'll be talking about then. Also, it's quite nice sometimes to begin with the thing that you noticed first. So for me, it was the sound quality to the poem. So that's why my first paragraph really dealt with that. Feijin further immerses the reader in the auditory world of the child by using onomatopoeia through, for example, the creak of old wooden floorboards in line 9 and the creak of chairs being sat on, line 10. The fluttering murmurs, line 11, of the people on the other side of the bedroom door evokes in the reader the fluttering of butterfly wings, effectively capturing the softness and delicacy of the sound. So you can see how I'm not actually saying anything new. I've already looked at these issues, underlined them, and made little notes to myself in my annotated poem that we'd read through together. So you can see that I'm now using all of that information and I'm translating it into an essay, a written form. So, and again, I've now spent 2 paragraphs actually on the issue of sound, and I feel that is justified in a poem like this because it is a poem about the sounds of evening, and that's really important. It becomes clear in line 7 that the speaker is a child. He or she refers to mother, and that this child is in bed, separated from the activities and noises outside of his or her room. From line 12 onwards, the child hears the adult activities of a dinner party from which the child is excluded. For example, the clashing of dishes in line 17 and the babble of voices in line 19. As stated earlier, in the dark and silence of the bedroom, these unusual sounds appear to be louder than they would usually be during the daytime. So I've mentioned the speaker, I've discussed who the speaker is. I've again used some examples from the poem to back up this idea that I have that the child is in the bedroom and that these activities and things the child is hearing are outside somewhere else and things that the child is not a part of. So it's important, I think, in most poems to sort of address the issue of who's the speaker in the poem. And remember, speaker and poet are not the same thing. So don't assume that the speaker is Eleanor Feijin in this case. That would be incorrect to say this. The speaker is a child. We can't really say whether it's a boy or a girl either. There's no information in the poem to support one or the other idea. So in this case, I will just simply refer to it as a child. It could be a he, it could be a she. Okay, we continue now. The child listens with interest, not fear, even though not all sounds are identifiable. For example, the queer little noises that no one explains in lines 25 to 26. Now, we've already discussed that in the previous slides where we were looking at the poem itself. The tone implied by the word queer is not threatening, but rather one of peaceful curiosity. In this way, the child is slowly lulled to sleep by the sounds around him or her. The words, "and the world of my eyes and my ears melts like steam," lines 29 to 30, evokes that moment of peaceful drifting off to sleep and of senses shutting down. The simile, "like steam," in line 30, conveys this dissipating consciousness brought on by sleep. The sounds of the house become vaporous, like steam, losing their strength and substance, and the child drifts off to his or her dreams. So I've really now mentioned that there is a simile, but it's because I'm not mentioning it for the sake of mentioning that there is a simile in this poem. I'm mentioning it because it is important because of the poem concluding or resolving itself in sleep. And it's a very beautiful simile, and I've discussed what about it is effective in the sort of last few lines of that paragraph. The rhythm of the poem aids the encroach of sleep on the child's awareness of the evening sounds. It is gentle and soothing. The lines are kept short and simple, with each idea gently enjambed. For example, the laugh of my father at one of his jests, lines 15 to 16. The effect is that there is no overload of information and no sense of rush. The A-B-C-B rhyme scheme, along with the gentle stressed and unstressed pattern of each line, soothes the child to sleep. And we definitely pick up on that as we read the poem. So I've now devoted one whole paragraph to talking about rhythm and structure. Those often go together quite well, and I felt in this case it made sense to discuss those all together in one paragraph. And next comes my conclusion. The Sounds of Evening is an auditory delight, inviting the reader to close their eyes and listen. It is also a reminder that poetry is a sensory experience, as the poem so skillfully shows that through the power of words we can be brought closer to sharing this experience of listening in the dark. Again, I've underlined the title of the poem, The Sounds of Evening. My conclusion is actually very short. It's really more about the sort of final feelings or impressions about the poem. And this really for me was this idea that it also links to a larger idea about the ability of poetry to capture an experience, this completely sensory experience like listening, and to be able to translate it into words and language in such an effective way. And that's, I suppose, the lasting impression that I want to leave with my reader in this particular case. Again, it's not a long response paper. It's short, to the point. It is backed up with references to the poem, and it provides a sort of a way of understanding my reading of the poem, and that's really what you should be aiming for as well. So that's why the reading part is so important. You have to really read the poem over and over again until you really get a sense of your own reading of the poem. What strikes you about this poem? What's interesting about the poem? What's important about the poem? All those things have to come through finally in the essay that you write, and which will be then your assignment. I'm now going to just provide some general guidelines for the assignment. And these are just basic things that you should bear in mind when you do this. Please don't resubmit the poem. In other words, don't copy it into your assignment and turn it in, because that's going to push your similarity score up. So all you really need to submit is the essay part of the assignment. Please submit that as a Word document, not as a PDF, not as any other funny file, just a Word document is fine. Stick to the word count. That really, as I said in the other slides, this is not about having to discuss every single thing. I'm looking for, are you able to capture the essence and respond to the essence of this poem, and are you able to back that up? We're not looking for, are you able to discuss every little thing in the poem? Please edit your work carefully. That really goes without saying. Careless errors, spelling errors, grammar errors, all of that creates a really bad impression with your marker. So don't lose marks that way. And then finally, I just wanted to talk about the rubric and what you should really be aiming for here. So the rubric's divided into 3 criteria. So it's a very simple rubric, and I think it needs to be looked at in a general way. This is not an assignment that you can sort of, they're boxes and you can tick them off and then they're done. We really are looking for that kind of engagement with the poem, your ability to discuss and talk about and respond to a poem. So that really underlies everything. So the first criteria on the rubric is comprehension and interpretation, and that might include things like the theme, the attitude and the speaker, maybe other things. It's not an exhaustive list. And in this particular criteria, what we're looking for here is students who can clearly understand the poem. In other words, you've not misinterpreted the poem. And even though we can say, yes, it's true, there are many ways of reading a poem or understanding a poem, there are also cases where it might be blatantly incorrect because you have misread the poem. So that's obviously one of the things that we will be looking for here. Are you able to form a creative interpretation about the symbolic or metaphorical meaning of the poem? And are you able to support this with evidence from the text? So it really comes back to the idea of supporting what you're saying with evidence. And again, use the model that I've just talked you through to guide that. In terms of what does it mean to provide evidence, you must be able, if you're going to say, for example, if you were to say about Eleanor Fairgen's poem, this is a poem about a child who is fearful of the dark. Where in the poem is there evidence of that? And if you're actually looking for that, you're going to find it quite difficult to support that kind of statement. So that's really what we mean here, is that you have to be able to support the statements about the poem. And that'll obviously ensure that you've clearly understood it. So that's the first part, is the comprehension and your own interpretation of the poem that is linked to evidence and the poem itself. Then we're going to look at analysis, your ability to analyze a poem. So that's, in a sense, a very skills-based thing, but it's definitely checking for your understanding of the poetic devices that have been used. But the focus here is not on are you able to name them and identify them in the poem, but rather are you able to discuss the poem using these techniques to understand how the poet had the effect that he or she did. So in other words, how did these things, these poetic devices, how did they add to the effect and the overall response you had to the poem? So we're looking here for students who can insightfully describe several dominant elements and poetic devices used by the poet and thoughtfully relate how these are used by the poet to reinforce the theme, meaning, mood, or the feeling of the poem. So it really, I can't emphasize this enough. There's no point saying, oh, look, there's a simile here. Why do you mention that? What is important about the simile? Why is it an effective simile? How does it add to your experience of the poem and the poem itself? That's often a tricky one. So I think this is where your preparation, in other words, your multiple layers of reading have to come in, because you can't suddenly get to this without going through that process of reading the poem and then reading it with a pencil in hand and then analyzing and engaging with it that way first. And then the final section is the writing skills and mechanics. So really this is where I go back to the point that I just mentioned, where you must edit your work. You will get 10, well, there are 10 marks in the rubric allocated to grammar, tone, structure, and so on. So is your response well stated and logically structured? In order to get in this first band, you need to have no errors at all in grammar, sentence structure, or spelling. So it's worth really spending the time editing your work carefully. Okay, so I hope this video has shown you in a little bit more detail how to tackle this assignment. Which poem you choose with your assignment is up to you, and I think that's important, is that you need to choose one that speaks to you and that you have something to say about, and if you base your choice on that, I think the assignment or the essay that you produce will be more meaningful. If you have any further questions, please, you're always welcome to contact your lecturers, and they'll be able to answer more specific questions.